Hey, what's up, APUSH World? We have Chapter 27 of Alan Brinkley's American History for you today. This one focuses on the Cold War, a frequently tested topic both in multiple choice and essays for your AP exam. So let's get going and talk about the origins of the Cold War, and really we're going to try to answer what were the reasons for the tensions between the US and the Soviets. Well, the Soviet Union wanted a buffer zone after World War II. They wanted to be in control of countries in Eastern Europe to prevent another invasion, especially countries like Poland. And keep in mind, twice since 1800, the Soviet Union was invaded, going back to this guy, Napoleon Bonaparte. The U.S. and Britain delayed opening a second front during World War II to help out the Soviets, and that caused tension. And in 1945, we had the Yalta Conference. This is towards the end of World War II. And this is the last meeting of the big three of Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. Sadly, FDR will die about 2 months after this meeting. In this meeting, Stalin agreed to free elections in Eastern Europe, and he promised elections in Poland. And you'll hear this term, free and unfettered elections. That means that he promised open and free elections in Poland, although this never came true. He never held up his end of the bargain. He also said that the Soviet Union would join the United Nations, and Germany would be divided into 4 different zones. Now, the Potsdam Conference, July of the same year of 1945, notice we have some new people. We have Truman instead of FDR. At this conference, Japan is given an ultimatum to surrender, and Truman hinted to Stalin about having a new weapon, and this new weapon is the atomic bomb. Truman wanted to hold Stalin to his agreements at Yalta. He saw Yalta as a contract, and he wanted to make sure that Stalin would stay true to them, and he saw it again as a pact. The Chinese Civil War is happening during the 1940s, and you have the nationalists, which are led by Chiang Kai-shek, also known as Jiang Jieshi, and they are fighting against the communists in Mao, led by Mao Zedong. The U.S. supported the nationalists because they are not communists, and this will be a common thread throughout the Cold War. The United States is going to support leaders of countries that are not communist. In the 1940s, we have a new philosophy that emerges that is so important to know. So definitely make sure you understand containment. And this is created by George Kennan, and he was a former ambassador to the Soviet Union, and he believed that the threat of Soviet expansion should be contained. So kind of keep communism where it is and do not allow it to spread whatsoever. 2 forms of containment you should be familiar with include the Truman Doctrine, which gave $400 million in aid to Turkey and Greece. Absolutely know those 2 countries. And also the Marshall Plan, which was developed by Secretary of State George Marshall. And this provided $12 billion in economic aid to Europe. And the purpose of this was to rebuild the economies so communism does not seem so appealing. The National Security Act also was passed during this time, and this created the Department of Defense, also the CIA, and this increased the powers of the president. That will be a big theme post-World War II, that presidential powers will increase drastically. All right, the Berlin blockade happens in 1948. Stalin is upset with the West, and keep in mind, Berlin is located in East Germany, which the Soviet Union is in control of. So the Soviet Union decides they're going to shut off all contact between the West and Berlin, and they do so by closing all roads and railroads. This is not, I repeat, not the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall is not built until Kennedy's administration. So Stalin cut off all roads and trains headed to Berlin, and the U.S. responded by providing food, goods, etc. to citizens of Berlin, and they did so by flying planes, and this is known as the Berlin Airlift, and they would drop supplies. Here you can see an airplane being loaded up with milk to be dropped to citizens of Berlin. I'm wondering if one of these parachutes ever malfunction on the milk and crush somebody on the head. What do you think? Doubt it, but you never know. The Berlin blockade helps lead to the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. And this is the first peacetime alliance in U.S. history. So this is where the U.S. finally is absolutely ripped from its isolationist roots, and the first time in the history of the country that they have a peacetime alliance. Very, very, very important. The slogan of NATO is an attack on one is an attack on all. So all these countries will agree to defend each other. And the Soviet Union later in the 1950s responds with their version of NATO, which is known as the Warsaw Pact. Now, the year 1949 is a very bad year for the U.S. foreign policy-wise. We have the fall of China, in which China becomes communist, and Truman gets blamed for this. And this will have implications for future presidents, because no future president will want to see a country turn communist, especially because of all the heat that Truman took. Also that year, the Soviet Union detonates its own nuclear weapon, which they did so at a much earlier time than most people predicted. NSC 68 you definitely should be familiar with. This urged a more aggressive foreign policy and increased defense spending. And we'll see that the United States actually increases defense spending by over 400%. So let's talk about American society after the war. Why was the economy better post-World War II than post-World War I? And this sounds like it could be a great essay topic. Why were things better post-World War II in the 1940s and 50s? Well, consumer demand was very, very high. During the war, there was little consumer spending. Most people were saving their money because there were not a lot of goods that were being produced. So many goods were being produced to be used for the war effort. We also have a very important bill that's passed, which is called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill, which provides loans for education, farms, and businesses for soldiers returning from the war. Women, blacks, and Hispanics were pushed out of jobs for returning white soldiers, so you see unemployment increasing for those groups. Harry Truman campaigns on a platform called the Fair Deal, and he proposed more Social Security, increased the minimum wage, and he also proposed a national health insurance as well, which it obviously does not happen during his time. Think of the Fair Deal as essentially a continuation of the New Deal. The biggest success of the Fair Deal came in minimum wage and housing. The Taft-Hartley Act is passed over Harry Truman's veto, and this limits the power of unions. And one way it does it is by outlawing the closed shop, which required businesses to hire only union members. Definitely know that the Taft-Hartley Act is a blow to unions, and it reverses some of the gains made under the Wagner Act during the New Deal and FDR's administration. All right, the election of 1948. Dewey does not defeat Truman, contrary to what the Chicago Tribune said in the paper. I have a bobblehead obsession, and here is my bobblehead of Harry Truman. You'll notice he is holding that newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman. The Chicago Tribune incorrectly called the election in favor of Dewey, the governor of New York. And all the blue is Truman. You can see that he wins most of the states. Truman campaigned vigorously for the election in 1948 via railroad. Do you remember what other person traveled thousands of miles on the railroads to campaign? It happened in 1896. If you said William Jennings Bryan, you are absolutely correct. And what was the name of his famous speech he gave at the Democratic Convention? You should know this too. Cross of Gold. Look at you getting that right. Yeah, you did. And Truman did not achieve many gains in civil rights. He proposed many things, but Congress did not approve them. And some of what he proposed included federal protection of black rights, abolishing poll taxes, but those do not happen until much later in the 1960s. What he does do, though, is issue Executive Order 9981 in 1948. You should definitely know this. And this desegregated the U.S. military. The first war that will be fought with desegregated units will be the Korean War. So let's talk about the Korean War. In June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. North Korea is communist. South Korea was not. They took over almost all of South Korea. So Truman saw the invasion as an act by the Soviet Union. He thought the Soviet Union orchestrated this invasion. So the U.S. drastically increased its military size and spending. They invoked NSC 68 and again spent over 400% increase in military spending. Eventually, North Korea is pushed back beyond the 38th parallel. China intervenes soon at this point on November 25th on behalf of North Korea, again because China is communist. And General MacArthur, this famous individual who was a part of getting rid of the bonus army in 1932 and also was the leader of the Pacific Front in World War II. He wanted to fight a large-scale war and attack the Chinese, and Truman says absolutely not. He was afraid of going to war with China and then possibly the Soviet Union. So MacArthur criticizes Truman's plans, and he is later fired. Flash forward to the end of the war, in July of 1953, Eisenhower, who is now president, agreed to a division of North Korea at the 38th parallel, which included a demilitarized zone. So this war ends with nothing gained and nothing lost, except for, sadly, the thousands of people who did die. But in terms of territorial gains and government gains, there were none. All right, so back in the United States, we're going to focus on what is known as the Second Red Scare. And I do have a video on that in the description below, as well as one on the election of 1948, the Taft-Hartley Act, presidency of Harry Truman, and I'm missing another one, but it's in there. HUAC, the House Committee of Un-American Activities. You absolutely positively need to know this. The prominent member of this was Richard Nixon, not Joseph McCarthy. And you'll see why I'm saying that in just a moment. What this committee did was investigate suspected communists, and they investigated this guy, Alger Hiss, who was a one-time aide to FDR. He was accused of sharing 65 classified documents. He is indicted and sentenced to 5 years in jail for perjury. He was never convicted for spying because the statute of limitations had expired at that point, but he was convicted of perjury. The Hollywood 10 were called to testify before HUAC, and these were 10 screenwriters from Hollywood that refused to testify, and they were sentenced to jail. Many activities during this time became associated with communism, and these included declining religious sentiment, increased sexual freedom, agitation for civil rights. Basically, anything you did that was out of the ordinary, what people believed was out of the ordinary, was associated with communism. Harry Truman issues a loyalty oath program. This is Executive Order 9835, and all federal employees were expected to take a loyalty oath, and thousands of them were either fired or resigned for not taking this oath. The McCarran Internal Security Act is also part of Truman's administration, and this required communist organizations to register with the government. So you see lots of hunting for communist and communist organizations. Let's talk about the Rosenbergs, husband and wife couple, Julius and Ethel. They were convicted of giving atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets. They both were sentenced to death and did die by the electric chair, I believe it was. However, in 2008, classified documents revealed that the prosecution knew Ethel was innocent. Julius was absolutely guilty. Ethel was innocent, but they went after her anyway in the hopes of getting a confession out of Julius. McCarthyism is usually what people associate with the Second Red Scare. Joseph McCarthy was a senator, and he was seen as a demagogue. And a demagogue is a leader that capitalizes on prejudice and false claims to gain power. And again, he is from Wisconsin. He accused State Department officials of being communists. He claimed to have in his hand a list of 250 members of the State Department who were known communists. And the downfall, this happens for a couple of years. He kind of scares people out of constant committees and he's interviewing people. But his downfall happened when he attacked the army on national TV. People finally got to see him on TV and he came across as a bully. Arthur Miller's The Crucible about the Salem witch trials was actually an allegory to McCarthyism. He wrote it during this time as a critique of McCarthy and McCarthyism. All right, let's do a quick recap for this chapter. Definitely know the GI Bill helped out economically with soldiers returning from World War II. Containment was by George Kennan, and this influenced the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. Both dealt with Europe, except the Truman Doctrine was only for Turkey and Greece. The loss of China in 1949 hurt Truman politically and will impact future presidents. The Rosenbergs were convicted of spying, and McCarthyism was a part of the Second Red Scare. NSC 68 quadrupled the defense spending of the military, and Truman's Fair Deal was a continuation of FDR's New Deal. At the Yalta Conference, Stalin promised free and unfettered elections. That did not come true, especially in Poland. And HUAC was a committee investigating communist. Richard Nixon, not Joseph McCarthy, was a leading member. NATO is the first peacetime alliance that the United States joined in history as well. All right, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope I was able to clarify Chapter 27 for you. If you have not already, please take a moment and subscribe to my channel. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button below. If you have questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I will get back to you. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day, guys.